So here we have a handful of philosophical texts that are often like recommended and talked about in various introductory discussions about philosophy that I personally think are very overrated. Now, overrated doesn't mean bad. Friedrich Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra, I really love that book. I think it's amazing. The Tao Te Ching, various translations across the centuries, absolutely love that book. Civilization and Its Discontents. But instead of being negative and trying to say various slightly negative things about books that I probably couldn't write myself, I thought what we'd do is we'd run through each of them and propose alternatives that are variously similar either in topic or in difficulty, usually not both, so as to actually propose an alternative to some of these very, popular intro to philosophy books that you'll probably see at a lot of bookstores, a lot of pick these beginner philosophy text listicles and videos and things. And hopefully, if you're looking for an introductory philosophical text, which I think is always a fun adventure to get into, that's my opinion, then you'll have some quality, refined, and tasteful recommendations that are less about trying to check a box and read the book that everybody's talked about before, and more about actually trying to find some good information in some really quality books that are beautiful and accessible or not. Let's just get into it. Okay, so first of all, we had The Myth of Sisyphus by Albert Camus, and this is kind of the stand-in for basically all the writings of Camus. I guess it's this and The Stranger that really get talked about the most. But I also would throw Sartre and de Beauvoir kind of in this category of this popular 20th century French existentialism that can be fun to talk about, and it has its moments. I think I have an essay book of Camus that I wouldn't be against, reading through. But I don't know. I think that the general consensus on this one is that it is a beginner text for a reason. So what are some better options? Well, if you're looking for a French guy, I recommend Francois Rabelais' Gargantua and Pantagruel. Now, I'll refer you to the other videos that I made on Gargantua and Pantagruel, including a video that I made specifically about how Francois Rabelais' insight on the myth of Sisyphus supersedes, in my opinion, at least a popular quote that Camus had about it. So moving on to some other existentialists, I feel like if you have to go through that field of looking at existentialism, I would personally recommend Soren Kierkegaard above Camus. If you're going to look at Kierkegaard, there's a few books of his I would recommend. You could either go with either or repetition, right? That's either or repetition. Either one. Not to repeat myself, but really between the two. Then we have Fear and Trembling. Fear and Trembling is, I think, the one I've actually read. Kierkegaard isn't for everyone. I don't think that he is the greatest philosopher of all time or anywhere close. I don't think he's better than Nietzsche or anything, for example. But I find it hard to think of an example of another writer that I've ever read who writes like Soren Kierkegaard. In Fear and Trembling, he's basically reflecting on one story from the Bible, the story of the sacrifice or the almost sacrifice of Isaac at the hands of Abraham. I forget which book of the Bible that's in. And for I don't know how many, dozens and dozens of pages, he just vividly and with such a striking emotional depth, especially for a philosopher, he just reflects on all the implications of this myth. And it's kind of like a circular thinking, but instead of it being pointlessly thinking around in circles, it kind of feels like Kierkegaard is deliberately stirring our thoughts around this topic until with enough turns and enough re-articulations of his reflections on the problem problem of this Bible story, the sacrifice of Isaac, or the would-be sacrifice, it starts to almost like he's cooking, bring these new ideas into being, like the concept, for example, of the night of faith and the night of infinite resignation. It's a very striking writing style, and I think it's also probably slightly different from some of his other approaches here. Either or is more of it at least kind of starts off as a book of aphorisms and letters, where I think half of the book is written from the perspective of somebody who's basically choosing nihilism, where the other half of the book is from the perspective of somebody who isn't, and that's where you get your existentialism and your modern thinking towards what meaning and purpose is and all this. But more than Kierkegaard or Camus, I would personally recommend Simone Weil if you're looking for some philosophical contemplations on existence and purpose and life. Simone Weil is kind of a whole bag of worms. I think she deserves her own video. But Gravity and Grace, I find to be a very accessible text if you ever enjoyed anything like Nietzsche or even Camus or Kierkegaard. This book has a lot of short aphorisms that kind of like Nietzsche, that hit you like a truck. There's a lot to contemplate in the short aphorisms, and I personally feel that she is a lot wiser than Camus or even Kierkegaard. And that's the whole point of being a philosopher, right? It's to be wise. So there you go, Simone Weil, Gravity and Grace. That's orders of magnitude better than Camus. And she's still French, I think. So you can keep that vibe of reading a French book, right? That's always very aesthetically appealing. Okay, so the next book I don't like, is Marcus Aurelius and his meditation. So I personally very much dislike how this book is constantly touted as the best intro to philosophy book that's out there. I think that Marcus Aurelius would agree with me, because his meditations are just that. They're his meditations. It's basically his diary. The way I interpret it is he was the Roman emperor, right? And he was tired after a long day of work, and then he just, in order to prevent himself from getting really stressed, wrote down some motivational quotes that he learned. And good for him. I think that probably helps with his mental health or whatever. But if you want a Stoic philosopher, if you want a Latin philosopher, Cicero, Seneca, I'm sure that they're much more focused and oriented around the actual philosophical concepts. In a recent video, I already talked about Cicero versus Marcus Aurelius. But if what you're looking for is an introductory philosophical text that kind of reveals a bit of the psychology of a philosopher and his meditations on his own life and philosophical journey, I personally think that Ecce Homo by Friedrich Nietzsche is a lot more interesting. It's still short, it's still accessible, just like Meditations. Maybe it's a little less accessible just because Nietzsche is, a bit of an idiosyncratic character. Marcus Aurelius is a bit more of a normie, so, there you go. Maybe that's why it's more popular. But Ecce Homo is a very, very funny book. It's almost similar to Kierkegaard. It's got these meandering, emotionally charged meditations and reflections that are a little bit more engaging than a lot of other philosophical writing. And Nietzsche, I think, does a good job of laying out the basics of his philosophical thinking. So at least on a very beginner level, it might even serve as a decent entry point to the work of Nietzsche if you wanted to, give that a shot. So yeah, Ecce Homo, much better than Meditations. Okay, then we have The Prince by Niccolo Machiavelli. I read this a long time ago, and so I'm gonna, offer that there's room, that there's more depth to this text that I didn't pick up on. But basically what I got out of The Prince is, this book has a reputation for being very, cutthroat and very the reputation it has a lot of weight behind it and a lot of mystique of this Machiavellian idea. That word itself carries so much weight and power that I personally don't know how that's deserved, because my impression of Machiavelli is that it's little more than a treatise on game theory. If you ever take like critical thinking or introduction to logic and syllogism and this kind of technical side of philosophy, game theory is basically like an attempted conception of something like a science around decision making, where the pros and cons of each course of action are kind of like mathematically weighted. And as far as I'm concerned, Machiavelli is just applying this to politics. And I'm sure that it does end up resulting in certain like cutthroat policies, but at least from my memory of reading this a long time ago, I didn't really pick up on any like excessive harshness that would go along with that, the mystique of that term, Machiavellian. I think that if you want a book from the Italian Renaissance that gives advice to people seeking political power, then the Book of the Courtier by Baldassare Castiglione, or Castiglione, however you say that, is much better. It's much more entertaining. I feel like it's a little bit more applicable to somebody who's actually trying to ascend in society. I mean, most of us aren't going to be a game theoretical prince. Exactly. I feel like the Book of the Courtier delves a lot more into like the interpersonal relations side of, being a courtier, right? Basically a socialite, person who's trying to gain some advantage for themselves in life because of their wit, their decorum, and their mastery of it, when to breach it, when to follow it. And it's full of, I think a lot of very sarcastic and humorous, jibs at certain social norms and certain kinds of people in these, what probably amounts to often a very pretentious environment of, oh, good sir, it's very fine to see you on this Thursday afternoon. And what they really mean is, if you don't get out of my house now, I'm going to send somebody to, send you to the bottom of a lake, right? They're Italians, everything else. So yeah, I'm like 95% sure you'll have like a much more enjoyable time with the Book of the Courtier than you ever would with Machiavelli as the prince. But if what you care about is like the philosophical side of it, and you want to get into like that game theoretical comparison of like how to advantage versus disadvantage yourself in like all these minute situations, I feel like Thomas Hobbes's The Leviathan is much more comprehensive and precise. Probably a lot harder to read though. That would be the only drawback there. Okay, The Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu. Okay, so this book is not overrated. This actually might be one of the greatest books in human history. The reason why I'm saying that it's, quote, overrated is that I do think the preponderance of all kinds of English translations of the Tao Te Ching in every single bookstore, where, I don't know, even if it is like a really academic translation, the vast gulf between how Chinese characters in like whatever this was, like late Zhou dynasty China versus how language works in English today. Like, my understanding of this book is if you really want to take it seriously, you have to read 2 different translations to start. Like, that would be like the baseline, and then probably more than that as it goes along, especially because it's a shorter text and you can pretty easily like interchange the translations and compare them. So I don't think the book itself is overrated. I do think that our idea of like, oh yeah, this is the catch-all like Chinese philosophy book that we should all read because it's like, it has a cool name and there's like a tree on the cover and that's nice, makes me feel it's actually kind of like the background that I use in this video. It gives a very Tao Te Ching cover art vibe, you know what I mean? Like there's a lake and a reflection and oh man, it's like, it just relax into the void, give yourself to the Tao of the tree and the lake. But there are other books of Chinese philosophy other than this one. In fact, I don't know like what the historicity is of this, but I was reading a book called The Chinese Literary Canon. I'll try to show some citation for that. And there's apparently a like anecdote in Chinese scholarship about the Tao Te Ching where the reason why this book exists at all is that Lao Tzu, who did not believe in writing anything down, the Tao that can be named is not the eternal ever-living Tao, of course, right? But some like political guy thought he was a cool sage, and so he wanted to have a writing of his to preserve, and so he refused to let Lao Tzu pass through his city or whatever unless he provided him with like a philosophical text that he could like show people and like, hey, Lao Tzu came through here and here's what he thinks about life and trees next to lakes and stuff. And so Lao Tzu was like, okay, fine. And he wrote this in like an afternoon. He's like, okay, I'm leaving now. And so to center that like text, which was composed, Lao Tzu didn't even want to write it, right? Apparently, at least according to that anecdote. But with the Book of Chuang Tzu, I think you have a much more substantial and deliberate attempt to elaborate the Taoist philosophy. There are other books of Taoist scripture that you can get translations of. I forget what the other one's called. It starts with the W, which is also attributed to Lao Tzu as well. But with Chuang Tzu, you get like these stories, and I'm not going to speak very much to it because I actually haven't read it yet myself, but I understand that these stories of Chuang Tzu are, they're supposed to be pretty funny, or at least, light and engaging and, fun to try to think through the whatever Taoist puzzlement of them and whatever else. So I think it would probably serve as maybe a better introductory text, unless you just want to read something that's short, which is probably another one of the appeals of the Tao Te Ching. Alternatively, I think that the writings of Hafez, here I'm showing the complete Divan of Hafez, but there's also probably a more accessible English version called The Gift. I'm not sure about the quality of the translation there. I can't speak to it. And then Dick Davis's Faces of Love, which also includes poetry from two other poets from Shiraz. Hafez is also, I think, if you want to pick a non-Western writer that's easy to read, at least, on the surface level. It's, not very long text, and then it's like deeply heartwarming, light, gentle, philosophical poetry or spiritual poetry. I personally think Hafez is probably going to be just as, if not more, enjoyable. Hafez is a little bit more oriented towards like divine love and having that articulated through metaphors of drinking and romance, whereas Lao Tzu is a lot more like rooted and meditative about nature directly and the concepts themselves. But as for what I think people are usually looking to get out of these texts, I feel like what they offer is ultimately something similar. And then in both cases, if you want to get serious about it, you can look at multiple translations, learn more about the biography and the time period that they come from, and try to take it more seriously. All right, then we have Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And we've already talked about Nietzsche in this video as an alternative to one of the overrated texts. But in this case, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which, by the way, I love. I think this is the first Nietzsche book that I wrote. I've memorized passages from it. I've been very, very inspired by it. I think it's really wonderful. But it needs to be understood that it's basically a mystical acid trip novel, more so than traditional like philosophical text. So if you go into trying to study philosophy with this as the introductory text, like, I don't know what kind of a skewed picture that's going to give you what studying philosophy is about. And if you want to read Nietzsche, I don't know. I hear people have different opinions about it. Some people really resonate with this and they find it understandable and attention grabbing, especially the first book of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which is, I think, a little bit more comprehensible compared to the later parts of this book. But by all accounts, the Joyous Science or the Gay Science, Beyond Good and Evil, and the Genealogy of Morals, and then maybe like Twilight of the Idols are better for actually trying to understand Nietzsche's philosophy. At least that's what many academics would say. And I do think that you are kind of going more directly to the source of what Nietzsche's ideas are with those more aphoristic, philosophical, sometimes even essay-oriented texts. Nietzsche's essays too, I think, especially like the ones in Untimely Meditations, are really, really amazing. There's some of the, I did I think 2 or 3 videos on the use and abuse of history, which I think is one of the best essays of all time. But that's not to knock on this book. The alternatives I'll recommend, once again, Gravity and Grace by Simone Weil. Again, she's similar to that, at least in this book, the aphoristic style of Nietzsche. And I've only read this once. I'm really still very much a beginner when reading Simone Weil. Her philosophy might be going in a slightly different direction, but I get the sense that if she read Nietzsche, I don't know if she did, but she very well might have, she would probably like look at it and be like, yeah, okay, I get it, but I'm just going to focus my thought in a slightly different direction. Like what I'm saying is I think that she understands what Nietzsche understands and goes somewhere else with it, which I think is really impressive. Not everybody just understands ideas about truth and our relationship to it and things like that on that level. But we already talked about that. If you want a example of like German philosophy at its best, and you don't want to go into like Hegel and Kant and whatever these more technical works, I think Faust is probably like orders of magnitude then better than Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Goethe in his philosophy I think is at a similar level to Nietzsche, but without all of that basically like adolescent adjacent angst that comes along with Nietzsche's, descent into madness and everything else that goes with that. So like when people are talking about like, oh yeah, the greatest beginner philosophy books and best books of the Western canon, I feel like Thus Spoke Zarathustra gets a lot more love than Faust, and like that on an objective level is ass backwards, right? Like I like both writers. It's not like a personal prejudice thing like it will basically be with our next writer and kind of was with Marcus Aurelius. It's just a question of Goethe probably being a better thinker. Here's a couple of videos that I did about him. Okay, and then the next thing I would suggest is William Blake. So I have like barely read William Blake. I can't speak very much to it. But I studied Nietzsche in university, and my supervisor actually pointed me to this text, The Marriage of Heaven and Hell by William Blake, which in his assessment, I did kind of skim through this. I didn't really pick up on this myself. But the idea being that just like Nietzsche has this, beyond good and evil concept, and he is trying to search out the root of Western morality and refine and revive it, William Blake apparently has like the same capacity with The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. Now, my perusal of it, which was not very serious, did not leave me very impressed. I was kind of like, okay, so he's saying we should be evil. Like to me, that seems simplistic, but I also realized that William Blake is like a whole can of worms that I have yet to wrap my head around. But I do think that would be another, alternative to reading Nietzsche. Okay, Sigmund Freud, Civilization and Its Discontent. What this is meant to represent is basically the whole psychoanalysis field, itself. We're going to use Freud here as an example, but whether it's Carl Jung or, I don't know, I have no idea about any of these people, Lacan or Zizek or whatever. I personally think this whole field is like a little overrated. So we seem to have this idea, like basically derived from Freud and Jung and similar, that psychological depth and going deep into the layers of your subconscious is like the deepest and most interesting thing that a person can do. And that this is one of the great like innovations of the last few centuries. We can finally think about the shadow self or whatever. First of all, I think that this is just wrong. Like if you read medieval literature and you don't think that they had like a deep understanding of something like psychology, I don't know, I feel like that's just like willful ignorance maybe in the very interest of supporting Freud, of bolstering this, psychologism kind of thinking. But throughout history, we see lots of examples of madness and psychological complexity being understood in what I think is a much more sophisticated way, because unlike I think the perception that we're sometimes taught, where before Freud we had like a flatter understanding, a less sophisticated understanding of human psychology, I think it might be the opposite, where previous understandings of human psychology were more rich than what psychoanalysis offers, because they had a spiritual dimension as well. Now, whether you believe in a spiritual reality or not, it's not my place to dictate, but the presence of that dimension of thinking does make it more complex. So I've got here Nizami Ganjavi's epic romance poem Layli and Majnun, which I talk about a lot on this channel. It's one of my favorite books. But how could a love story that's a poem, how could that be psychologically interesting? Well, the first thing to point out is that the title character's name, who I think his actual name is Kays, but this epithet that I think it is, Majnun means madman. So the whole book is about madness, or it's about Kay's madness, which is born from falling in love. And a lot of the episodes in the poem, which can be very contradictory and humorous and strange, there's an example where, he goes to war with Layli's clan to try to win her hand by force, and throughout the whole war he's basically like bipolar about whether he wants to fight to the death to pursue Layli because that's like fighting in the name of his love, or whether he's devastated that the war he started is happening at all because war is horrible, and also he's like killing his girlfriend's family, which I don't know, usually I don't think that like wins points with her, you know what I mean? And so all of these like seemingly contradictory elements throughout this epic, I personally think can be explained when you consider that he is insane, that he is like a madman. So of course pretty much everything he does is going to be completely contradictory. And of course, Nizami Ganjavi is writing like Sufi epics here, so there is a dimension of spiritual connection to God, which is what Layli represents. Her name, I believe, translates to veil, specifically veil for the divine. So you have this interplay of madness and searching, usually fruitlessly, for like the beyond realm, the spiritual higher order, layered with all of these, emotionally entertaining romantic episodes all along the way. You get an exploration of human psychology that I think just wipes the floor with anything of, dream interpretation or whatever that Sigmund Freud could offer, where you have these discussions of what the role of a person in civilization is versus when Majnun isolates himself into the wilderness because he doesn't, his spiritual quest doesn't fit with his presumed social role, where he's like not allowed to marry Layli because of political reasons. And I haven't read Civilization and its discontents, but from that title alone, it sort of implies to me, you can correct me if I'm wrong if you've actually read Freud, but is that not what he would be talking about? That we have like this shadow self that is not congruous with the behavior that society wants us to portray. And okay, we could listen to Freud like talk about that like some nerd for whatever 150 pages or whatever this book is, or we could go to one of the greatest romantic stories in human history and listen to how Majnun fell in love harder than any person probably ever has, and all of the extremes of asceticism, war, longing, poetry, nature, every aspect of human life and thought that he explores in his search for in his search for Layli. Come on, like it's way more interesting. And similarly, we have the Ramayana, another epic poem, this time from the Hindu tradition, which I didn't look at this translation. I'll try to put on the screen a translation I used. It says in this introduction that the Ramayana can also be, if you're not familiar, it's a story of a king who's banished from his kingdom and he has to win it back. Vast oversimplification, but the idea is that it can also be read as a metaphor for human psychology, where the banishment from the kingdom and all the battles with monkeys and demons and everything else that takes place across the entire epic poem is and can be read as basically on these multiple different levels. It can be read on a literal level, where it's basically a really badass, exciting story. I think there's a Ramayana movie coming out soon, which I feel like that could be interesting. Then one layer deeper, it is about human psychology and the banished king in your own heart. I think I mentioned this in the Why Does the West Hate Goodness video, where with the Shahnameh, where the rise and fall of kingdoms and empires, you can look at that as entirely a political concept, and it is, obviously, right? But there can also be kingdoms and empires and eras of your own life where the good demon, if you really want to simplify it, the good angel and the evil angel are having that battle over your soul as your life goes on, and basically turning those cartoon you've seen it in like Disney movies where the angel and the demon are like bickering with each other, turning that little whatever archetypal conflict into a continent spanning battle with flying monkeys and giant demons like batting each other out of the air, and it's a whole adventure and a half, right? And then of course the Ramayana is a spiritual epic. It pertains to the the tradition of the Vedas and the Hindu philosophies that I obviously don't understand on a very deep level, so that it still has yet another layer of spiritual meaning on top of that. Much better than Sigmund Freud is the point. All right, and we'll end with John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism. I'm not going to say very much about this. I feel like I've kind of said my piece with this video. So yeah, utilitarianism. I despise this book. I think that it's hogwash. I tried to read it once, and yeah, I don't think John Stuart Mill should be a real philosopher in our canon. This is my opinion. If you want to talk about morality, look at religious literature. This is an example of the Hadith literature. It's much simpler. It's much more direct. It's also probably just better, more accurate. Overall, I'm sure you can discuss points depending on your worldview, of course. Aristotle is going to be a lot more work to read than John Stuart Mill, but it's probably worth it. And then Nietzsche, again, with his whole, beyond good and evil, the genealogy of morals. Maybe that's a video for another time. All right, so thank you so much for sticking to the end. I hope you learned something new. I hope you found a book that you're excited to read now. I want to invite you to subscribe if you're interested in seeing more of this kind of thing, or check out my main channel or my Substack if you want to see my essays and my poetry. All that aside, thank you for watching the video, and I hope you have a wonderful day.